Today we begin our read aloud of What is the Civil Rights Movement by Sherri L. Smith. What is the Civil Rights Movement? One afternoon in March 1955, 15-year-old Claudette Colvin boarded a public bus for home. A deep brown-skinned girl with large, dark eyes and black-rimmed glasses, Claudette was a high school student in Montgomery, Alabama. On the bus, Claudette and three friends took seats in a row for black passengers. At the time, public buses in the South were segregated by race. Racial segregation meant keeping black people separated from white people. In Alabama, white passengers sat in the front rows marked by a sign that read white. Passengers of color had to take seats in rows behind the sign. If more white people boarded the bus after the white area was full, black passengers who had seats were forced to give them up. That's what happened to Claudette and her friends when a young white woman boarded the bus on their trip home. The other girls gave up their seats, but Claudette did not. Just for that, Claudette was arrested. She was locked up in an adult jail cell. I can still vividly hear the click of those keys, she later said. What made a teenage girl act so bravely? At school, Claudette had learned about Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth. Both African American women had fought for years against the injustice of slavery. Claudette believed staying in her seat was doing what they would have wanted her to do. She said, "It felt as though Harriet Tubman's hands were pushing me down on one shoulder, and Sojourner Truth's hands were pushing me down on the other shoulder. I felt inspired by these women because my teacher taught us about them in so much detail. I wasn't frightened, but disappointed and angry because I knew I was sitting in the right seat." Ida B. Wells, 1862 to 1931. Like Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth, Ida B. Wells was an early activist for African American civil rights. An activist is someone who takes action for a cause they believe in. Wells was a black journalist from the South. Her best known writing was about the horror of lynching. Lynching is when a mob or group of people commits murder. Many black people were lynched across the South for false crimes. Wells wrote about these evil killings for audiences around the world. White people where she lived in Memphis, Tennessee, were so angry about her work that they burned down her office and chased her out of town. But Wells didn't give up. She worked for justice her entire life. In 1909, she helped create the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The NAACP helped plan many civil rights protests. It still exists today. Claudette took a stand for civil rights that day. Civil rights are protections promised to all citizens of the United States of America, like the right to vote or the right to an education. Big changes can start with the bravery of a single person. Claudette was one of the many brave people who would work together for the three great promises of America: life, liberty, and happiness. Chapter 1: A Troubled Past. When people talked about the civil rights movement, they usually mean the period in the 1950s and 1960s when African Americans fought for the same rights that white people had. Segregation was the worst in the South. Besides having to sit in separate rows in buses, black people went to separate schools, drank from separate water fountains, stayed in separate hotels, lived in separate neighborhoods, and were not allowed to vote. The United States Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal. But when it was written in 1776, one out of every five people was enslaved. They had been kidnapped from Africa and sold to white Americans like property. In the southern states, white people depended on slave labor to run their farms and plantations. But many northern states wanted to make slavery illegal. Rather than agree to this, in 1860, 11 southern states began to break away. In 1861, they formed a new country, the Confederate States of America. It included Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, Texas, Arkansas, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Virginia. The border states of Kentucky and Missouri had divided loyalties. The North wanted the states to stay united. This led to the Civil War. The gray area shows the Confederate States, and here is an illustration of the American Civil War. When it ended in 1865, the South had lost and slavery in the United States was over at last. The following year saw the first Civil Rights Act. It said all people born in the United States were considered U.S. citizens. As citizens, Black people now have the right to full and equal benefit of all laws as enjoyed by white citizens. In 1870, a new Civil Rights Act attempted to support Black men's right to vote as granted by the 15th Amendment. Even so, African Americans continue to face discrimination. Discrimination means they were treated differently because of the color of their skin. The Southern states created new laws that denied African Americans their rights. These were called the Black Codes, also known as Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow was a character in music shows that made fun of Black people. White actors would darken their faces with burnt cork and dress in rags. Jim Crow was clumsy and not very smart. He was meant to insult Black people. Jim Crow laws were used to make Black people second-class citizens. Second-class citizens are people who are not given equal rights. Jim Crow laws made it hard for Black citizens to lead a decent life. White people would not sell farmland to Black people or allow them to attend good schools. African Americans were prevented from voting, so they could not elect people who would fight on their behalf. Many African Americans moved to the North or out West for a better life. From 1915 to 1970, around 6 million Black people migrated from the South. They still faced racism and unfairness, but life was harder for those who remained. Racism was not restricted to the South. Even the Supreme Court ignored the rights of Black citizens. The Supreme Court is the highest court in the nation. What it says is the law remains the law. In 1896, a case went before the Supreme Court. The case was called Plessy versus Ferguson. Homer Plessy was a Black activist who challenged a new law in Louisiana that blocked people of color from riding in white train cars. This law took away freedoms Plessy had grown up with during Reconstruction. With his fair skin color, he was able to buy a ticket for the white car, but a train conductor threw him out. Plessy and a local civil rights group filed a legal complaint. The Ku Klux Klan. After slavery ended, some white men in the South created a group called the Ku Klux Klan. It's also known as the KKK or the Klan. Klan members believe in white supremacy. They think white people are superior to Black people. There are about 3,000 Klan members in the United States today. In the past, the Klan often attacked and murdered Black people. Klansmen would wear white robes and pointed white hoods that covered their faces during lynchings. That way, no one could tell who had committed the crime. The Klan attracted members in both the North and South, but not all white people were Klansmen. Some, including Southerners, believed Black people should be treated as equals, but it was not always safe for them to say so. Their lives were at risk. Everyone lived in fear, but some brave people began to stand up for themselves. No amount of fear could stop them from fighting for their civil rights. The Supreme Court judges said Homer Plessy did not have the right to sit in the white car. They said segregation was legal as long as both white people and people of color were given separate but equal accommodations. For trains, accommodations would mean the seats and access to food and a bathroom. While accommodations were indeed kept separate, they were far from equal, particularly in the South. And yet, for the next 60 years, separate but equal was the law of the land. Chapter 2, A Long Walk to School. Schools in the South were separate but not equal. White schools were in nicer buildings with new textbooks and school buses. Black students often walked long distances to school in all kinds of weather. Black schools received old textbooks thrown out by white schools. Some didn't even have flushing toilets. So this is a white classroom, and this is a Black classroom. It was hard to get a good education if you were Black. That meant it was harder to get a good paying job. 7-year-old Linda Brown had a very long walk to her school in Topeka, Kansas. As she later recalled, it was several blocks up through railroad yards and crossing a busy avenue and standing on the corner and waiting for the school bus to carry me 2 miles across town to an all black school. In the winter, the walk was unbearable. I remember walking, tears freezing up on my face because I began to cry because it was so cold. Why couldn't she go to the other school just a few blocks from her house? Because it was for whites only. In 1951, Linda's father went to court. He said not allowing Linda to go to the local white elementary school went against the 14th Amendment's promise of equal rights. A famous civil rights attorney named Thurgood Marshall brought the case all the way to the Supreme Court. He went on to become the first Black Supreme Court justice. On May 17, 1954, the court declared segregation in public schools to be unconstitutional. Unconstitutional meant it went against the laws laid out in the U.S. Constitution. The court said separate could never truly be equal. Schools should start integrating right away. Integration means to mix separate groups together. The decision was called Brown versus Board of Education. But many white people ignored the law. The city of Little Rock, Arkansas did not integrate schools until September 1957. The first Black students to do so were known as the Little Rock Nine. The local White Citizens Council wasn't happy with the news. The Citizens Council was like the KKK. But instead of hiding behind robes and hoods, they were businessmen. They used money and friendships with politicians and the police to get their way. The Citizens Council threatened the Little Rock Nine as well as their families. Angry white people from all over the South came to town to block the entrance to the all-white Little Rock Central High School. On September 4, 8 of the 9 students were driven to the school, only to be stopped by the National Guard. The National Guard is a volunteer U.S. military group. The governor of Arkansas had sent them to stop the teenagers from entering the school. Unfortunately, one student's family did not have a telephone and did not know about the carpool, so Elizabeth Eckford ended up facing the mob all alone. Here's Elizabeth Eckford on her first day at Central High School. News cameras snapped pictures of the brave girl holding her head up as people spat and yelled at her, but the guard would not let her inside. On September 23, all 9 students entered the school together using a delivery entrance, but the angry crowd outside stormed the building and the Little Rock Nine were forced to flee. President Dwight Eisenhower sent 1,200 soldiers and the National Guard back to Central High to keep the peace. On September 25th, the Little Rock Nine entered the school with an armed military escort. One of them said, "For the first time in my life, I feel like an American citizen." Military protection remained in Little Rock for the rest of the school year. Even so, the Little Rock Nine were bullied by white students and teachers alike. One day, Minnie Jean Brown was tripped in the cafeteria and ended up dumping a bowl of chili on a white boy's head. A few months later, Minnie Jean was kicked out of school for trading insults with another white student, but the other 8 kids remained. Ernest Green was the first Black graduate from Central High. No one clapped when he received his diploma, but he had survived. The Little Rock Nine had one another, but in New Orleans, Louisiana, one little girl had to face the crowds alone. Her name was Ruby Bridges, and she was only 6 years old. On November 14, 1960, Ruby was taken to an all-white elementary school by U.S. Marshals. Marshals are federal law enforcement officers. At first, Ruby thought the crowd of white people outside of the school was a parade. Then they started shouting threats and throwing eggs at her. White parents dragged their children out of the building. In the end, only one teacher agreed to take Ruby on, but no other students joined her class. Many years later, Ruby said protesters outside the school didn't see a child, they saw change in what they thought was being taken from them. 2 years later, an even bigger mob greeted James Meredith at the University of Mississippi in Oxford. The school is also known as Ole Miss. The crowd threw rocks, guns were fired, a white journalist was killed in the fighting. President John F. Kennedy had to send federal troops onto campus to stop the violence. The troops used tear gas and force until the mob fell apart. It took 500 U.S. Marshals to protect Meredith as he registered for class. Soldiers remained with him until he graduated in 1963. Meredith spent the next 2 years overseas earning an economics degree in Nigeria. He returned to the United States in 1965 to earn his law degree and continue the fight for civil rights. James Meredith graduates from the University of Mississippi. Okay, so next time we will read Chapter 3, The Montgomery Bus Boycott.